It started with a letter. Not the kind of letter you'd expect, no heartfelt words, no birthday wishes, not even a coupon for 10% off at the local diner. No, this was the kind of letter that made Michael's blood boil before he even finished reading the first line. Notice of violation, it screamed in bold, ominous letters at the top. The culprit? His elderly mother Evelyn, a sweet woman who spent her days baking cookies and watching reruns of Matlock. Her crime? Failing to pay a $100 HOA fee. Now, Michael wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but this had all the makings of a ridiculous power play by the HOA, the Homeowners Association, or as he liked to call them, hell's overzealous administrators. They had always been a thorn in his side, with rules so absurd they could make Kafka blush. No pink flamingos on lawns? Check. Mulch must be exactly the right shade of red? Double check. Garage doors open for no longer than 5 minutes? Triple check. But evicting an 82-year-old woman over $100? That was a new low. Michael stormed into his mother's kitchen, waving the letter like it was evidence in a courtroom drama. Evelyn looked up from her crossword puzzle, adjusting her glasses with the kind of calm only someone who's lived through decades of nonsense could muster. "They're evicting you," Michael said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Evicting me?" Evelyn replied, her tone more curious than concerned. "For what?" "For not paying this $100 fee," Michael exclaimed. Evelyn frowned and tapped her pencil against the table. "Oh, that fee. I thought I paid that months ago." "Well, apparently not," Michael said, slapping the letter onto the table. "And now they're threatening foreclosure." Evelyn picked up the letter and squinted at it. "Foreclosure? Over $100? That seems excessive." "Excessive doesn't even begin to cover it," Michael said. "This is tyranny dressed up as community management." Michael had always known HOAs were trouble. They were like that one kid in school who tattled on everyone for chewing gum, only now they had legal power and an unhealthy obsession with lawn care. But this wasn't just about $100, it was about principle. No one messes with his mom. He decided to investigate further. Armed with nothing but Google and righteous indignation, Michael dove into HOA bylaws like they were ancient scrolls hiding secrets of oppression. What he found was both hilarious and infuriating. Rules so convoluted they could rival tax law and penalties so arbitrary they felt like something out of a dystopian novel. For instance, Evelyn's alleged violation stemmed from a late payment on an HOA fee that had been increased without proper notice, a clear breach of their own bylaws. Or the HOA president, Patricia, whom Michael now referred to as Queen Petty, had signed off on these changes without consulting residents. Michael couldn't believe what he was reading. This wasn't just incompetence, it was outright villainy wrapped in suburban bureaucracy. The next day, Michael marched into the HOA office armed with copies of their bylaws, Evelyn's payment history, and a steaming cup of coffee he didn't plan to drink. It was purely for dramatic effect. "Patricia," he said as he entered her office without knocking. Patricia looked up from her desk, where she was arranging pens by color, a task that seemed fitting for someone with her level of micromanagement skills. "Can I help you?" she asked in a tone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "You can start by explaining why you're evicting my mother over $100, Michael said. Patricia sighed and leaned back in her chair. "It's not personal," she said. "It's just policy." "Policy?" Michael scoffed. "Your policy is illegal." Patricia raised an eyebrow. "Illegal?" "Yes," Michael said, slapping the bylaws onto her desk with enough force to scatter her perfectly aligned pens. "You increased fees without proper notice and used HOA funds for personal projects." Patricia's face turned red, whether from embarrassment or anger, Michael couldn't tell. But she quickly regained her composure. "I assure you everything we do is within our rights," she said coolly. "Then you won't mind if I take this to court," Michael replied. Patricia blinked but said nothing. She clearly hadn't expected pushback, especially not from someone who knew how to read legal documents. Michael walked out feeling victorious but knew this was just the beginning. He spent the next week preparing his case, gathering evidence, interviewing other disgruntled residents, and drafting letters to local media outlets about HOA corruption. Evelyn watched him work with amusement. "You're really going all out," she said one evening as Michael typed furiously at his laptop. "They messed with the wrong family," Michael replied without looking up. Evelyn chuckled and returned to her crossword puzzle. She didn't seem worried about eviction, probably because she knew something Michael didn't yet know. The showdown came during an emergency HOA meeting called by Patricia herself, a desperate attempt to quell dissent before things got out of hand. The room was packed with residents eager to see what would happen next. Michael stood up and delivered a speech worthy of a courtroom drama, highlighting Patricia's violations, exposing her misuse of funds, and calling for transparency in HOA operations. The crowd cheered, Patricia fumed, Evelyn clapped politely from her seat in the back. But then came the twist, the moment that changed everything. Evelyn stood up and walked to the front of the room. "I think it's time I said something," she began calmly. Michael froze, Patricia looked confused. Everyone else leaned forward in anticipation. "I'm Evelyn Thompson," she continued, "and I'm retired now, but for 40 years I worked as a lawyer specializing in property law." The room erupted in gasps. Patricia dropped her pen. Michael grinned like he'd just won the lottery. Evelyn turned to Patricia and smiled sweetly. "So if you'd like to take this matter to court, I'd be happy to represent myself and everyone else here who feels they've been wronged." It was over before it began. Patricia resigned within days, eviction notices were rescinded, and HOA bylaws were rewritten under Evelyn's watchful eye. As for Michael, he learned two important lessons: never underestimate his mom and always read the fine print when dealing with HOAs. Michael sat in his home office, surrounded by a mountain of papers that looked more like the aftermath of a tornado than an organized investigation. HOA bylaws, financial statements, and community notices were strewn across his desk. Somewhere in the mess was Evelyn's eviction notice, the spark that had ignited this crusade. If Patricia thought she could bully his mother out of her home with a flimsy $100 fee, she clearly underestimated Michael's ability to turn petty grievances into full-blown warfare. "All right, let's see what we're dealing with," Michael muttered as he flipped through the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS. These documents were supposed to be the backbone of the HOA's authority, but they read more like a bad novel, long-winded, confusing, and full of plot holes. Rule number 47. All lawns must be mowed to a height of exactly 2.5 inches. Rule number 83. Trash cans must be placed on the curb no earlier than 7 a.m. and no later than 7:15 a.m. on collection day. Rule number 112. No holiday decorations may be displayed before December 1st or after January 5th. Michael shook his head. These weren't rules, they were micromanagement on steroids. But buried deep within the CC and RS was something far more sinister, a clause allowing the HOA to impose fines for non-compliance without specifying what constituted non-compliance. It was vague enough to give Patricia carte blanche to invent violations at will. "Convenient," Michael muttered sarcastically. He dug deeper into the HOA's financial records, well, at least the ones he could access publicly. That's when he stumbled upon something that made him laugh out loud. Patricia had recently approved a $10,000 expenditure for community beautification. The beautification project? A dolphin-shaped fountain installed in her own backyard. "Of course," Michael said, rolling his eyes. "Because nothing says community like a private dolphin fountain." It didn't stop there. Patricia had also signed off on landscaping upgrades for her property using HOA funds and charged residents an administrative fee for processing their monthly dues, fees that conveniently went straight into her personal account. If corruption were an Olympic sport, Patricia would have taken home the gold. Michael decided it was time to bring in reinforcements. He called up a few neighbors who had been vocal about their dissatisfaction with the HOA. There was Susan, who had been fined $50 for having an unapproved shade of mulch, and Greg, who received a violation notice for parking his car facing the wrong direction in his own driveway. "You're telling me she evicted your mom over $100? Susan asked incredulously during their impromptu meeting at Michael's kitchen table. "Yep," Michael replied. "And that's just the tip of the iceberg." Greg leaned forward, his face red with anger. "She fined me $200 last year because my Christmas lights were too bright." Too bright? What does that even mean? "It means Patricia has too much time on her hands," Michael said dryly. Together, they began piecing together a case against Patricia and her HOA regime. Evelyn joined them occasionally, offering legal advice between crossword puzzles and cups of tea. "You know," Evelyn said one afternoon as she reviewed their findings, "this isn't just mismanagement, it's outright abuse of power." Michael nodded. "She's running this HOA like her personal kingdom." "And kingdoms fall," Evelyn said with a sly smile. The group decided to confront Patricia directly at the next HOA meeting, a monthly spectacle where residents gathered to air grievances while Patricia pretended to listen. This time, however, Michael and his crew weren't coming to complain, they were coming to overthrow. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building that somehow managed to smell like both mildew and burnt coffee at the same time. Patricia sat at the head of the table, flanked by her loyal minions, Carl, the treasurer who couldn't balance a budget if his life depended on it, Linda, whose sole contribution seemed to be nodding enthusiastically at everything Patricia said, and Bob, who was there mostly because he liked free snacks. Michael took a seat near the front and waited patiently as residents voiced their usual complaints about lawn care regulations and noise ordinances. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood up with a stack of papers in hand. "Patricia," he began, "I'd like to discuss some irregularities in how this HOA is being managed." Patricia raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "For starters," Michael continued, "can you explain why $10,000 of HOA funds were spent on a dolphin fountain that happens to be located in your backyard?" The room fell silent. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat but quickly recovered. "That fountain is for community use," she said defensively. "Oh really?" Michael shot back. "Because I don't recall seeing any community members invited over for dolphin viewing parties." A few residents chuckled nervously. "And what about these landscaping upgrades?" Michael pressed on. "Or the so-called administrative fee that goes directly into your account?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond but closed it again when she realized there was no plausible excuse for any of it. Michael turned to the other residents in the room. "This isn't about rules or regulations, it's about power and greed. Patricia has been using our money to fund her lifestyle while punishing anyone who dares step out of line." Susan stood up next. "He's right. I've been fined for things that aren't even violations." Greg followed suit. "And I'm sick of being treated like a criminal because my car isn't parked correctly." One by one, other residents began sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and outright harassment by Patricia and her cronies. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Patricia's reign was over. The residents voted unanimously to remove her from her position as HOA president and launch an official investigation into her misuse of funds. As Patricia gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the clubhouse in disgrace, Evelyn leaned over to Michael and whispered with a grin, "I told you kingdoms fall." Michael smiled back and replied, "And sometimes they fall hard." The fallout from the HOA meeting was nothing short of spectacular. Patricia's abrupt dethroning sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents who had previously tiptoed around her iron-fisted rule were now emboldened, swapping stories of her ridiculous fines and questionable spending habits over backyard fences like gossiping revolutionaries. Michael, however, knew this wasn't the end, it was merely the opening act. Patricia might have been ousted, but she wasn't going down without a fight. True to form, Patricia retaliated with a move so predictable it was almost boring. She lawyered up. Within days, Michael received a letter from her attorney, an overly formal document accusing him of defamation, harassment, and inciting unrest among HOA members. The phrasing was so melodramatic it sounded like something ripped straight out of a political thriller. "Well," Evelyn said as she read the letter over her morning coffee, "it looks like Patricia found herself a lawyer who's just as ridiculous as she is." Michael smirked. "Defamation? Harassment? Inciting unrest? What am I, Che Guevara?" Evelyn chuckled and set the letter aside. "Don't worry, dear. If this is the best they've got, we'll have them eating their words in no time." Michael wasn't worried, he was fired up. Patricia's attempt to silence him only fueled his determination to expose her corruption once and for all. He decided to escalate his efforts by filing an official complaint with the state attorney general's office, outlining every shady transaction and unethical practice he'd uncovered in his investigation. Evelyn helped him draft the complaint, sprinkling it with just enough legal jargon to make it sound intimidating. Meanwhile, Patricia doubled down on her defense strategy, or rather, her offense strategy. She began spreading rumors around the neighborhood, painting Michael as a troublemaker who was trying to destroy the community. She even went so far as to accuse Evelyn of being senile and unfit to live independently, which was laughable considering Evelyn's sharp wit and encyclopedic knowledge of property law. "Oh, she's good," Evelyn said one evening as Michael recounted the latest gossip circulating among their neighbors. But not good enough. The real showdown came when Patricia filed a lawsuit against Michael and Evelyn for damages caused by their malicious actions. The case was scheduled for a hearing at the local courthouse, a modest building that looked more like a repurposed post office than a bastion of justice. Michael knew this was his chance to turn the tables on Patricia once and for all. On the day of the hearing, Michael and Evelyn arrived at the courthouse armed with binders full of evidence, financial records, meeting minutes, and even photos of Patricia's infamous dolphin fountain. Evelyn carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades dismantling legal arguments for breakfast. Michael, on the other hand, felt like he was stepping into an episode of Law and Order minus the dramatic music. Patricia arrived shortly after them, flanked by her lawyer, a man named Theodore who looked like he'd been plucked straight out of a corporate boardroom. Theodore wasted no time launching into his opening statement, painting Patricia as a victim of unprovoked attacks by Michael and Evelyn. "This case is about preserving the integrity of our community," Theodore declared with all the gravitas of someone auditioning for a Shakespearean play. "My client has dedicated herself to serving this neighborhood selflessly for years, only to be met with baseless accusations and unwarranted hostility." Michael tried not to laugh. If anyone had been hostile, it was Patricia, and he had plenty of evidence to prove it. When it was Evelyn's turn to speak, she rose from her seat with an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. She began by dismantling Theodore's arguments piece by piece, pointing out inconsistencies in Patricia's claims and highlighting her blatant disregard for HOA bylaws. "Let's talk about integrity," Evelyn said, her voice steady but sharp. "Integrity isn't using HOA funds to install fountains in your backyard or fining residents for imaginary violations. Integrity is following the rules you claim to enforce and holding yourself accountable when you fail to do so." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Evelyn presented her evidence, receipts showing Patricia's misuse of funds, emails revealing her unilateral decisions without resident approval, and testimonies from neighbors who had been unfairly targeted by her fines. By the time Evelyn finished speaking, it was clear that Patricia's case was crumbling faster than a poorly constructed sandcastle. Even Theodore seemed flustered as he scrambled to counter Evelyn's arguments. But then came the piece de resistance, the moment that would go down in neighborhood history as legendary. Evelyn revealed that she had uncovered additional evidence during her investigation. A series of fraudulent documents signed by Patricia that falsely inflated HOA fees for personal gain. These documents, Evelyn said as she held them up for everyone to see, are not only unethical, they're illegal. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Theodore looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Patricia turned pale. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully before delivering his verdict. Not only was Patricia's lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, but she was ordered to repay every cent she had misappropriated from HOA funds and face potential criminal charges for fraud. Michael couldn't contain his grin as he watched Patricia slink out of the courtroom in defeat. Justice had been served, not just for him and Evelyn, but for every resident who had suffered under Patricia's reign. As they left the courthouse together, Evelyn turned to Michael with a satisfied smile. "Well," she said matter-of-factly, "I think we've made our point." Michael laughed. "You think? Mom, you just took down an entire regime." Evelyn shrugged modestly. "It wasn't that hard. People like Patricia always think they're untouchable, but they forget one thing." "What's that?" Michael asked. Evelyn grinned mischievously. "No one is untouchable when you know how to play by their rules better than they do." After the courtroom victory, Michael and Evelyn returned home to a neighborhood that felt like it had been liberated from years of tyranny. Patricia's downfall was the talk of the town. The HOA members who had once cowered under her rule were now walking around with newfound confidence, as if they collectively shed 50 pounds of oppressive regulations. Lawn flamingos were popping up everywhere, trash cans were left out overnight without fear, and one particularly bold resident even painted their house a shade of neon green that could be seen from space. Chaos? Maybe. Freedom? Absolutely. Michael leaned back in his chair, savoring the sweet taste of victory as he watched Evelyn flip through her crossword puzzle book. She looked as serene as ever, but Michael knew better. Beneath that calm exterior was a woman who had just orchestrated one of the greatest suburban takedowns in history. "You know," Michael said, sipping his coffee, "I think Patricia might actually be allergic to accountability." Evelyn didn't look up from her puzzle. "Most people in power are," she replied casually. "It's why they cling to it so desperately." Michael chuckled. He couldn't argue with that. But while Patricia had been dethroned and publicly humiliated, there was still work to be done. The HOA itself needed a complete overhaul, new leadership, new rules, and most importantly, a new attitude. Evelyn naturally was elected as interim president by unanimous vote during the next HOA meeting. It wasn't even close. The residents practically begged her to take charge. "I'm retired," Evelyn protested at first. "I don't have time for this nonsense." But Michael knew better. His mother couldn't resist a challenge, especially one that involved fixing broken systems and putting bullies in their place. "Fine," Evelyn finally agreed. "But I'm not doing this alone." And so began the great HOA reform project of Maplewood Estates, a campaign that would go down in local history as both revolutionary and hilariously unconventional. Evelyn wasted no time implementing changes. First on her agenda was eliminating all the ridiculous rules Patricia had put in place. Out went the mulch color mandates, the garage door timers, and the ban on pink flamingos. In their place came rules that actually made sense: keep your property tidy, respect your neighbors, and don't use HOA funds for personal dolphin fountains. Michael watched in awe as Evelyn transformed the HOA with the efficiency of a seasoned general. She held weekly meetings where residents could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation, a radical concept for a community that had spent years under Patricia's thumb. She even organized a neighborhood barbecue to foster goodwill among residents. The barbecue was a roaring success, or at least it would have been if Greg hadn't accidentally set his grill on fire trying to cook 20 burgers at once. But even that minor disaster couldn't dampen the mood. Everyone pitched in to help and laugh at Greg's expense, proving that Maplewood Estates was finally becoming a true community. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with Evelyn's reforms. Patricia, now stripped of her title and facing criminal charges for fraud, spent her days sulking in her house and glaring at anyone who dared walk past her property. She'd even installed security cameras on every corner of her yard, presumably to protect herself from imaginary mobs carrying pitchforks. "She's like a disgraced dictator hiding in exile," Michael joked one day as he and Evelyn walked past Patricia's house. Evelyn smirked but said nothing. She didn't need to. Patricia's misery spoke for itself. As weeks turned into months, Maplewood Estates flourished under Evelyn's leadership. The residents were happier, the neighborhood looked better than ever, and even Greg managed to redeem himself by hosting a successful pancake breakfast with no fires this time. Michael couldn't help but feel proud, not just of his mother but of the entire community for standing up against corruption and reclaiming their dignity. One afternoon, as Michael helped Evelyn sort through some old HOA paperwork, he stumbled upon something unexpected: a letter from Patricia addressed to Evelyn. It wasn't handwritten. Patricia didn't seem like the sentimental type, but it was clearly an attempt at reconciliation. Evelyn read the letter aloud. "Dear Mrs. Thompson, while we may have had our differences in the past, I would like to extend an olive branch and offer my assistance in managing HOA affairs moving forward." Michael burst out laughing before she could finish reading. "An olive branch?" he said incredulously. "From her? Is she serious?" Evelyn folded the letter neatly and set it aside without comment. "What are you going to do?" Michael asked. Evelyn shrugged. "Nothing." "Nothing?" Michael echoed. Sometimes, Evelyn said wisely, the best revenge is letting people stew in their own irrelevance. Michael couldn't argue with that either. As life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a dramatic upheaval, Michael found himself reflecting on everything they'd accomplished together. What started as an eviction notice over $100 had turned into a full-blown revolution against greed and corruption, and it all happened because Evelyn refused to back down. "I guess you were right," Michael said one evening as they sat on the porch watching kids play tag in the street. "About what?" Evelyn asked. "Kingdom's Fall," Michael replied with a grin. Evelyn smiled back but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her actions had spoken louder than words ever could. And so Maplewood Estates entered its new era, a chapter defined not by petty fines or dolphin fountains but by community spirit and mutual respect. Evelyn eventually stepped down as HOA president once everything was back on track. She claimed retirement really did suit her, but her legacy lived on through every pink flamingo proudly displayed on front lawns across the neighborhood. As for Patricia? Well, let's just say she learned an important lesson about karma and about underestimating retired lawyers who happen to have very determined sons. If you enjoyed this story of suburban justice served with a side of humor, don't forget to like, share, comment below with your thoughts or your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of everyday heroes taking down tyrants.